My brother called me. Lost cause. Less than 5 minutes before I realized I was completely alone. The diagnosis didn't break me. Hearing that I needed heart surgery was terrifying, but it was something I could face. What shattered me was discovering that the people I'd spent my entire adult life protecting no longer believed my life was worth saving. I sat inside my car in the hospital parking garage with my phone resting on my lap, staring at the dark screen and convincing myself Grant would call back. Surely he hadn't meant what he said. Surely my little brother, the boy whose scraped knees I'd cleaned and whose mistakes I'd covered for since he was a child, wouldn't leave me like this. Every few seconds I glanced at the screen again, expecting his name to appear. It never did. That silence was louder than anything the cardiologist had told me that morning. My name is Marin Holloway. I'm 35 years old, and for the last 12 years I've been the Chief Operations Officer of Holloway Custom Furnishings, the family business my father built from nothing more than determination, borrowed equipment, and an impossible dream. Most people outside the company assumed my younger brother Grant was the one keeping everything together. He was charismatic, confident, and loved standing in front of clients with expensive suits and polished speeches. I rarely stood in front of anyone. While Grant celebrated new contracts, I was inside the factory solving production delays, negotiating with suppliers, calming worried employees, and making sure every order left the warehouse on time. I never cared who received the applause because I honestly believed success belonged to all of us. My father used to tell me that the strongest beams in a house were the ones nobody noticed until they disappeared. I liked being one of those beams. I thought my family understood that. I couldn't have been more wrong. 3 weeks before that phone call, I started noticing little things that didn't seem important. Walking across the production floor left me strangely out of breath. Carrying a box of sample materials made my chest tighten. I blamed stress because running daily operations for a company with more than 300 employees isn't exactly relaxing. Every problem eventually landed on my desk. When a supplier missed a shipment, they called me. When machinery broke down, they called me. When employees needed help, they came to my office first. Grant liked telling people he was building the company's future. I was usually too busy protecting its present to argue. One afternoon, I nearly collapsed halfway through a production meeting. The room spun just long enough for me to grab the edge of the conference table before anyone noticed. Nora, our human resources director, and one of the few people who had worked beside my father from the beginning, looked at me with genuine concern. She insisted on driving me to urgent care that evening. I laughed, told her I was probably dehydrated, and promised I'd schedule an appointment. Instead, I went back to work the next morning because another client deadline couldn't wait. Looking back, I wonder how many people spend their entire lives believing they'll have time to take care of themselves later. Eventually, my body stopped asking for permission. A week later, I woke up before sunrise with crushing pressure across my chest and finally agreed to see a specialist. After several hours of tests, scans, and uncomfortable waiting, the cardiologist walked into the examination room carrying my file. He didn't rush, he didn't smile. He sat across from me and quietly removed his glasses before speaking. Somehow that simple gesture frightened me more than anything else. Ms. Holloway, he said, you have a severe mitral valve condition. Medication can manage the symptoms for a short time, but surgery is the safest option. I strongly recommend scheduling it as soon as possible. I stared at him without answering. Surgery. Recovery. Weeks away from work. My mind wasn't thinking about dying. It was thinking about unfinished contracts, payroll, and employees who depended on me. He patiently explained the procedure, the success rate, and what recovery would look like. I nodded through most of it, but the conversation didn't truly become real until the financial coordinator entered the room carrying another folder. She looked almost embarrassed before she even sat down. Your insurance covers most of the procedure, she explained carefully. But there's still an out-of-pocket balance that must be paid before we can reserve the operating room. I swallowed. How much? $4,200. The number echoed inside my head. It wasn't enormous. It wasn't impossible. Years ago, I could have written that check without thinking twice. But over the past several years, I'd emptied nearly every personal account. I had to keep our company alive. During supply chain shortages, I'd refinanced my condo to help cover payroll because I refused to let longtime employees lose their jobs. When expensive machinery failed unexpectedly, I'd postponed replacing my own aging car so production wouldn't stop. Every financial decision I'd made seemed reasonable because I believed I was protecting my father's legacy and my family's future. Sitting in that office, I realized I'd spent so much time saving everyone else that I no longer had enough left to save myself. I thanked the coordinator because none of this was her fault, gathered the paperwork, and walked back to my car. For nearly 20 minutes, I searched every bank account on my phone, hoping I'd forgotten about some emergency savings. There wasn't enough. I calculated again. Then again. I came up short every single time. $4,200 stood between me and the surgery that could save my life. I considered applying for another loan, but my previous application had already been rejected because too much of my income depended on company performance. Selling my car wouldn't happen fast enough. Borrowing against my condo wasn't an option anymore. I looked down at my contact list. My thumb stopped on Grant's name. My younger brother had recently bought a luxury lake house, drove an expensive SUV, and loved talking about his investment portfolio. $4,200 probably disappeared from his account without him noticing. I hated myself for making that call. He answered almost immediately. "Hey, Marin, I'm busy. What's going on?" I took a slow breath and explained everything. The diagnosis, the surgery, the insurance payment, the deadline. At first he didn't interrupt. For one hopeful moment, I thought he was listening. Then he sighed. "You actually expect me to pay for this?" "It's a loan," I answered quietly. "I'll pay you back." His voice turned colder than I'd ever heard it before. "Marin, you're already a lost cause." My entire body froze. "Excuse me. You've sacrificed your whole life for a company that never gave you anything back. Now you're sick, exhausted, and broke. Throwing more money at this isn't going to change who you are." "Grant, I just need a little help. I have investments to protect. I have plans. I'm not wasting over $4,000 on someone who probably won't recover enough to matter." My throat tightened so badly I could barely speak. "I'm your sister." "That doesn't change the numbers." The call ended before I could say another word. I stayed there staring at the blank screen, waiting for guilt to bring him back. It never did. Finally, I started my car and drove toward my mother's house because, somewhere deep inside me, I still believed a mother couldn't possibly hear what her daughter was facing and turn her away. As I pulled into the driveway, the first thing I noticed wasn't the lights inside the house. It was Grant's brand new SUV already parked beside the front porch. Suddenly, I had the awful feeling that whatever hope I still had was about to disappear too. I sat in my car for almost a full minute before forcing myself to get out. Grant's black SUV gleamed in my mother's driveway like a trophy. It was less than a year old, spotless, and probably worth more than everything left in my savings account combined. I remember thinking how strange it was that someone could spend that much money on a vehicle but decide $4,200 was too much to save his own sister. I told myself not to judge him too quickly. Maybe he'd already spoken to Mom. Maybe they were inside discussing how to help me. Maybe I'd misunderstood everything. Hope has a funny way of surviving long after logic tells you to let it go. I walked slowly toward the front door, clutching the folder from the hospital against my chest. Every step felt heavier than the last. Before I could knock, I heard laughter coming from the dining room. It wasn't forced or polite. It was the kind of carefree laughter people share when they're celebrating something exciting. I almost turned around right then. Instead, I rang the bell. My mother, Eleanor Holloway, opened the door with a surprised expression that disappeared almost as quickly as it came. "Marin, I thought you were at work. Can I come in?" She hesitated for a second before stepping aside. "Of course." The dining room table was covered with takeout containers, dessert plates, and a bottle of champagne that had already been opened. Grant leaned back comfortably in his chair, scrolling through his phone with a smile that instantly faded when he saw me. "Didn't expect to see you today," he said casually. My eyes moved across the room. There were printed documents spread over the table, along with what looked like presentation materials carrying the company logo. I recognized one of them immediately. It was the agenda for the upcoming board meeting, where our next CEO would officially be announced. My chest tightened for reasons that had nothing to do with my heart. "What's all this?" I asked. Grant shrugged. Just preparing for next month. Mom poured herself another glass of sparkling water before answering. Your brother has a lot of responsibilities coming up. Not once did either of them ask why I looked exhausted. Not once did they notice the hospital bracelet still wrapped around my wrist. I stood there for several seconds waiting for someone to ask if I was okay. Nobody did. Finally, I placed the folder on the table. I was at the hospital. Mom looked up briefly. Everything all right? It was the kind of question people ask because they're expected to, not because they actually want the answer. No, I replied. I need heart surgery. The room fell quiet for only a moment. Grant slowly set his phone down but didn't look shocked. He looked impatient. I already talked to her, he told Mom. She called me earlier. My mother turned toward him instead of me. You did? Yeah. Then she faced me again. Grant said you asked him for money. There wasn't a trace of concern in her voice, only disappointment. I asked for a loan. I corrected gently. The insurance doesn't cover everything. Mom sighed. Marin, your brother has worked incredibly hard to build his future. I stared at her. So have I? It's different. Those two words hurt more than they should have. Different. Somehow my years of 12-hour days, canceled vacations, sleepless nights, and personal financial sacrifices had become different. Less valuable, less worthy. Grant folded his arms. You always make emotional decisions. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Emotional. I refinanced my condo to keep this company from laying off employees. Exactly, he answered. You keep throwing yourself into impossible situations and expecting everyone else to rescue you afterward. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was unbelievable. The company needed payroll. I protected all of us. No, Grant replied calmly. You protected your own need to play the hero. My mother nodded as if his words made perfect sense. Grant has a point. There it was. The sentence I'd heard in one form or another my entire life. Grant has a point. When we were children, Grant broke a neighbor's window playing baseball. Somehow I was blamed because I should have been watching him. When he failed college economics, Mom insisted the professor had treated him unfairly. When I graduated at the top of my business program, she smiled politely before asking whether I'd remembered to congratulate my brother for completing another sales internship. Grant's victories were celebrated. Mine were expected. Looking back, I should have recognized the pattern much sooner. After Dad passed away 6 years earlier, I postponed accepting an executive position with a national manufacturing company because someone had to stabilize Holloway Custom Furnishings. That offer would have doubled my salary. Instead, I stayed. I worked weekends, skipped holidays, and slowly poured almost everything I owned back into the business. I never regretted that decision because I believed I was honoring my father's dream. What I didn't realize was that everyone else had started treating my loyalty like free labor. Mom, I said quietly, I don't need charity. I just need time to recover so I can come back to work. She looked down at the paperwork on the table. Grant is preparing to take over much larger responsibilities. This isn't a good time for financial distractions. Financial distractions. That was how my surgery was described. $4,200 stood between me and a healthy future, and my own mother considered it an inconvenience to my brother's promotion. I reached into my folder and slid the estimate from the hospital across the table. Neither of them picked it up. Grant barely glanced at it before pushing it back toward me with 2 fingers. I'm sorry you're sick, he said, though he sounded anything but sorry. But business has to move forward. I looked from him to my mother, hoping, still hoping, that someone would stop this conversation before it became irreversible. Instead, Mom quietly said, maybe you should focus on getting whatever treatment you can afford. Whatever treatment you can afford. I suddenly understood something I'd spent years refusing to admit. They had already planned the company's future without me. My illness hadn't changed their plans. It had simply made them more convenient. I picked up my folder, thanked them for their time out of pure habit, and walked toward the front door. Neither of them followed. As I reached for the handle, I heard Grant laughing softly behind me. We'll make sure everything keeps running while you're gone. I stepped outside before they could see the tears filling my eyes. As I walked back toward my car, my phone vibrated. The caller had showed a name I hadn't expected to see that day, Malcolm Reed, my father's attorney. Malcolm Reed almost never called without a reason. He had been my father's attorney for more than 25 years and had handled everything from contracts and acquisitions to Dad's estate after his passing. Even after Dad was gone, Malcolm remained one of the few people connected to the company who never seemed interested in office politics. If he reached out unexpectedly, something important had happened. I sat inside my car for a few seconds before answering, trying to steady my breathing. "Malcolm?" His calm voice came through the speaker. "Marin, where are you?" "Just left my mother's house." There was a brief pause. "Are you all right?" That simple question nearly broke me. It was the first time all day someone had actually wanted the answer. I swallowed hard before replying. "Not really." "Can you come by my office this afternoon?" he asked. "There's something your father wanted you to know if certain circumstances ever came to pass." I frowned. "What circumstances?" "I'd rather explain it in person." I looked down at the hospital folder resting on the passenger seat. My entire future felt like it was falling apart, yet Malcolm sounded strangely composed. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, I said. He replied. "And Marin, don't make any important decisions until we've talked." The line disconnected, leaving me even more confused than before. Malcolm's office occupied the second floor of an old brick building downtown that hadn't changed much in the last decade. The furniture was older than most of the employees at our company. The walls were lined with legal books, and a faint smell of coffee and polished wood filled every room. My father had loved the place because, as he often joked, nothing inside it ever tried too hard to impress anyone. Malcolm greeted me at the door with a warm handshake and an expression that immediately softened when he noticed how exhausted I looked. "You look like Victor did after the expansion project," he said quietly. I managed a tired smile. "I'm not sure that's a compliment." "It isn't." He led me into his office, waited until I sat down, then placed a cup of coffee in front of me, even though I hadn't asked for one. "Your father always said people make better decisions after coffee." For a moment neither of us spoke. Finally he folded his hands together. "How much do you know about the upcoming CEO appointment?" "Only what everyone else knows," I answered. "The board plans to vote next month." Malcolm nodded slowly. "And everyone assumes Grant will be selected." "Including Grant." He studied me carefully before asking, "Do you?" I hesitated. "Honestly, I stopped thinking about that a long time ago. Right now I'm more concerned about surviving long enough to watch the meeting happen." He sighed deeply. "Victor was afraid something like this might happen." I looked up. "What do you mean?" Malcolm stood, walked to a filing cabinet against the wall, unlocked one of the lower drawers, and removed a thick blue binder. The cover carried our company logo along with the words "Executive Governance Documents." He placed it carefully on the desk between us. "About 18 months before your father passed away, we spent several weeks reviewing the company's future," he explained. He knew his health was declining. More importantly, he knew his children were very different people. I felt my pulse quicken. Dad had never spoken to me about any of this. Malcolm opened the binder and turned several pages before stopping at a section marked with colored tabs. "Victor believed leadership wasn't measured by revenue or charisma," he continued. "I believed it was measured by responsibility." He slid the document toward me. Read the highlighted section. I lowered my eyes to the page. The legal language was formal, but one paragraph immediately stood out. It described a requirement for any future chief executive officer to demonstrate integrity, stewardship, and a consistent commitment to the welfare of both the company and the family that founded it. I looked back at Malcolm. "I've never seen this before." "Very few people have." "Why?" "Because Victor didn't want anyone pretending to be compassionate just to satisfy a rule. He wanted genuine character." I read further. Another paragraph caught my attention. It stated that the board retained the authority to deny or revoke a leadership appointment if credible evidence showed a candidate had knowingly abandoned a direct family member during a significant personal crisis for reasons of personal gain or convenience. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped speaking. Malcolm finished the sentence for me. "Yes, it's legally enforceable." I stared at him in disbelief. "Grant doesn't know about this. He knows the company has governance requirements. He never bothered reading the amendments." I almost laughed at the irony. Grant always claimed details were for other people. He focused on the headlines while assuming someone else handled the fine print. Malcolm leaned back in his chair. Victor worried that one day the company might become more important to someone than the people it was meant to support. My eyes drifted back to the document. Every word sounded like something my father would have written. Are you saying what happened today matters? Malcolm didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked a question of his own. Did your brother refuse to help you? I nodded slowly. He said I was a lost cause. Malcolm's expression hardened for the first time since I'd arrived. Did he say that in writing? No, it was a phone call. Heard any messages afterward? I thought for a moment. Not yet. He reached across the desk. From this moment forward, save everything. Every text, every email, every voicemail. Don't delete anything. No matter how painful it is to read. You're talking like this is already becoming evidence. I'm talking like your father understood human nature better than most people. The room suddenly felt much quieter. For the first time all day, someone wasn't telling me to give up. Someone wasn't treating my illness like an inconvenience. Malcolm wasn't promising revenge, either. He was simply asking me to protect the truth. I closed the binder gently. Malcolm, I don't want to destroy my brother. He nodded with surprising understanding. I know you don't. I just want my surgery. Then focus on your surgery, he said. Leave everything else to time. As I stood to leave, Malcolm opened another drawer and removed a sealed envelope with my father's handwriting across the front. He rested his hand on it, but didn't give it to me. What's that? I asked. Something Victor instructed me to keep sealed until the board officially begins the succession process. Can you tell me what's inside? He smiled sadly. No. I nodded, accepting the answer. Sometimes my father believed timing mattered as much as truth itself. As I reached the door, Malcolm spoke one last time. Marin. I turned around. Your father once told me that the greatest test of character isn't how someone behaves when everything is going well. He glanced toward the blue binder still lying open on his desk. It's how they treat family when helping costs them something. I left his office carrying no money, no miracle solution, and no guarantee that my future would be any brighter than it had been that morning. But for the first time since hearing the words heart surgery, I carried something else. The quiet feeling that maybe my father hadn't left me completely unprotected after all. Just as I reached my car, my phone buzzed with a new company-wide email. The subject line made my stomach tighten. Executive Leadership Transition Meeting. Mandatory attendance. I read the company-wide email 3 times before I finally accepted that it was real. Executive Leadership Transition Meeting. Mandatory attendance. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, less than 2 weeks away. According to the announcement, the board of directors would review the company's succession plan before holding the final vote for our next chief executive officer. On the surface, nothing about the email seemed unusual. Every senior manager had expected the transition to happen sometime that quarter. But after my conversation with Malcolm, every sentence carried a different weight. I knew something almost no one else inside the company knew. Somewhere inside the documents my father had left behind was a safeguard that could completely change the future Grant had already started celebrating. The strange part was that I didn't feel excited. I didn't feel victorious. I still couldn't stop thinking about my surgery. None of those legal documents mattered if I wasn't healthy enough to return to work. Over the next several days, my life became a strange routine of hospital appointments, medication schedules, and trying to pretend everything was normal whenever I walked through the factory doors. I wasn't ready to tell anyone outside a very small circle about my diagnosis. Rumors spread quickly inside family businesses, and I refused to become another topic whispered about in break rooms. I wanted people focused on their jobs, not wondering whether I was dying. That turned out to be much harder than I expected. By Monday morning, I noticed small changes everywhere. Grant had started holding meetings that normally would have included me. Department managers who usually came directly to my office were being redirected to him instead. Several purchasing approvals that legally required my signature suddenly arrived already stamped with Grant's authorization. It wasn't illegal, not yet, but it sent a clear message. My brother wasn't waiting for the board to choose a CO. He was already behaving like one. I stood outside the production floor watching employees load finished cabinets onto delivery trucks when Nora quietly walked over carrying a clipboard. She lowered her voice before speaking. You noticed it too, didn't you? I looked at her. Grant? She nodded. He's been telling people to bring major decisions directly to him. I forced a small smile. Maybe he's just trying to help. Nora didn't smile back. Marin, I've worked here 22 years. I know the difference between helping and replacing someone. Her words settled heavily inside me because they confirmed what I'd been trying not to believe. Grant wasn't preparing for a possible promotion. He had already erased me from his future. That afternoon, I attended a department budget meeting where Grant arrived almost 20 minutes late, carrying expensive coffee for everyone except me. It was such a small thing that nobody else probably noticed. I did. Little gestures often reveal far more than dramatic speeches. Grant stood confidently at the front of the conference room. Starting next quarter, he announced, we'll be restructuring operations to improve efficiency. I looked up from my notes. The board hasn't approved any restructuring. He smiled without looking at me. Planning ahead, one of our plant supervisors raised his hand. Shouldn't Ms. Holloway be reviewing operational changes first? Grant laughed lightly. Maren has enough on her plate these days. The room became awkwardly quiet. He hadn't mentioned my medical condition directly, but somehow everyone understood exactly what he meant. I chose not to respond. Getting into an argument in front of employees would only damage morale. After the meeting ended, several longtime supervisors quietly approached me one by one. None of them asked directly about my health, but they all asked variations of the same question. Everything okay? You still leading operations? Should we be worried? I answered each of them with the same calm reassurance. Keep doing your jobs. I'll handle the rest. The truth was I wasn't sure I could. Later that evening, after nearly everyone had gone home, I walked through the nearly empty factory by myself. The familiar sounds of machines shutting down echoed through the building. This place had been my second home for over a decade. I remembered helping Dad repaint these walls after college. I remembered eating pizza with employees during overnight production runs before major client deadlines. I remembered celebrating weddings, retirements, and babies with people who felt more like extended family than coworkers. Losing my position would hurt. Losing this place would break my heart. My phone vibrated just as I reached my office. It was another message from the hospital reminding me that the deposit for surgery needed to be confirmed within 5 business days or my operating date would be released to another patient. I closed my eyes for several seconds. That's all I had left. I opened my banking app again, even though I already knew the balance by memory. Nothing had changed. $4,200 still stood between me and the operation I desperately needed. I leaned back in my chair and quietly admitted something I'd been refusing to say out loud. I couldn't solve this alone. The next morning, I arrived at work early and found an envelope lying neatly in the center of my desk. There was no name on it. No note. Just a plain white envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $1,000. Folded beside it was a handwritten message. You've spent years taking care of all of us. Please let someone take care of you for once. Don't try to find out who left this. I stared at the note for several minutes, then another envelope appeared before lunch. $500, another anonymous message. By the end of the day, there were 6 envelopes inside my desk drawer. None of them contained large amounts of money. $200, $300, $100. Small contributions from people who probably couldn't afford to give them. Warehouse workers, office staff, supervisors. People whose birthdays I remembered. People whose children I'd watched grow up through company Christmas parties. They hadn't forgotten what I'd done for them over the years, even if my own family had. I sat alone in my office after everyone else had left, adding the checks together with trembling hands. $3,100. Tears blurred the numbers before I could finish. These people earned far less than my brother, yet they had quietly given what they could without asking for recognition or repayment. At that moment, I realized something that changed the way I viewed family forever. Sometimes the people who stand beside you aren't connected by blood. They're connected by loyalty. The following morning, as I prepared to call the hospital and explain that I was still short of the required amount, someone knocked softly on my office door. It was Nora. She closed the door behind her and placed one final envelope on my desk. This one's from the Employee Emergency Assistance Fund, she said gently. The committee voted unanimously last night. I looked inside. The amount printed on the check was exactly $1,100. enough to cover every remaining dollar I needed. Before I could thank her, Nora smiled through tears and quietly said, "No, go save your life, Marin. We'll take care of the company until you come back." At that exact moment, my office phone began ringing. The caller had displayed a name I hadn't expected to see again so soon. Grant Holloway. I stared at Grant's name on my phone until it stopped ringing. A second later it rang again. Then a third time. For someone who had dismissed me as a lost cause only days earlier, he suddenly seemed determined to talk. I finally answered, not because I wanted to hear his voice, but because I needed to know why he'd changed his mind. "What is it, Grant?" I asked. His tone was unusually upbeat, almost friendly. "Heard you've been taking a few days off. Everything under control." It was such a strange question that I almost laughed. He already knew exactly why I was taking time off. He simply wanted to see whether I'd admit how desperate my situation had become. I answered, "Good." There was a short pause before he continued. "Listen, the board meeting is next week. I'd appreciate it if you could attend, even if you're not feeling your best. It would look better if the whole family was there." I closed my eyes. There it was. Not concern, not an apology image. Optics, reputation. "Is that why you called?" I asked quietly. "We're about to enter an important chapter for the company," he replied. "People are watching." "People were watching when I asked you for help too." Silence filled the line. Then he cleared his throat. "Let's not revisit emotional conversations." Emotional conversations. That was how he described the moment he refused to help save my life. "I'll be at the meeting if my doctors allow it," I said before ending the call. I didn't wait for another response. The next morning I walked into the hospital carrying a cashier's check made possible almost entirely by people who owed me nothing. The woman at the billing desk smiled as she processed the payment. "You're officially confirmed," she said. "Your surgery is scheduled for Thursday morning." Relief washed over me so suddenly I had to grip the edge of the counter. For nearly 2 weeks my entire world had revolved around that payment. Now, for the first time since my diagnosis, I could focus on something more important than numbers. I could focus on surviving. Before leaving the hospital, I stepped outside and called Nora. "It's scheduled," I told her. I heard genuine excitement in her voice. "Good. Now stop thinking about work." I smiled. "You know that's impossible. Then let me make it easy." She lowered her voice. "The department managers agreed on something this morning." "What?" "We'll handle everything until you come back. No one's letting Grant turn this place upside down while you're recovering." I felt my throat tighten again. Every day it became clearer who truly believed in me. It wasn't the people who shared my last name. Surgery day arrived faster than I expected. Hospitals have a strange way of slowing time and speeding it up at the same moment. 1 minute you're signing paperwork. The next you're changing into a hospital gown while strangers explain procedures you've never wanted to understand. I lay quietly in the pre-operative room staring at the ceiling lights while nurses prepared equipment around me. Every sound seemed unusually loud. Rolling carts, soft conversations, heart monitors. The anesthesiologist introduced himself and explained what would happen over the next few hours. I nodded politely, though I barely heard half of what he said. My attention kept drifting toward the door. Not because I expected Grant or my mother to walk through it anymore. That hope had disappeared days earlier. I simply found myself wondering whether anyone from my family would come. About 20 minutes before I was taken into surgery, the curtain opened. Nora stepped inside carrying a small paper bag. Behind her stood Malcolm. For a second I couldn't speak. "Hospital rules only allow a quick visit," Nora said with a smile. "So don't yell at us." She handed me the paper bag. Inside was my favorite blueberry muffin from a bakery near the factory. "You can't eat it until afterward," she said. "But we figured you'd like knowing it's waiting." I laughed for what felt like the first time in weeks. Malcolm pulled a chair closer to the bed. "The board meeting has been postponed until next Thursday," he said. "That gives everyone time." I understood exactly what he meant. Time for me to recover. Time for the succession process to unfold correctly. Time for the truth to catch up with Grant. Before leaving, Malcolm rested a hand gently on the bedrail. "Victor would have been proud of how you've handled all of this." I looked away before he could see my eyes fill with tears. "I just hope I make it through." "You will," he answered without hesitation. "And when you do, don't rush back into battle. Heal first. Those were the last words I heard before the nurses wheeled me toward the operating room. When I opened my eyes again, everything was blurry. My chest felt painfully tight, and every breath reminded me that my body had just survived something enormous. A nurse noticed I was awake and smiled. "Welcome back." My voice barely worked. "It go okay. Your surgeon will speak with you soon." But everything went exactly as planned. I closed my eyes again, overwhelmed by relief. A few hours later, the surgeon confirmed the procedure had been successful. Recovery wouldn't be easy, but my prognosis was excellent. I should have felt nothing but gratitude. Instead, one thought kept returning to me. I was alive because warehouse workers, office assistants, machine operators, and supervisors had quietly come together to help me. Not my own family. During the next several days, I remained in the hospital while physical therapists slowly encouraged me to walk short distances. Every movement hurt, but each step reminded me that I had another chance. Nora visited twice. Malcolm came once with flowers from the board of directors. Several employees sent handwritten cards filled with encouraging messages. Grant never called. My mother never visited. Not even a text message asking whether the surgery had gone well. By the time I was discharged, I had accepted that silence as an answer. Malcolm insisted on driving me home himself. Instead of taking me to my condo, he surprised me by pulling into the quiet parking lot behind his office. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," he said. We walked slowly upstairs, my movements still stiff from surgery. Once inside, Malcolm placed another folder on the conference table. This one was much thinner than the governance binder I'd seen before. "The board has officially requested every document related to the succession process," he explained, "including performance evaluations, leadership records, and any evidence relevant to the family stewardship clause." He looked directly at me before continuing. "Marin, I need every text message your brother sent after your diagnosis." I unlocked my phone without saying a word. As I opened the conversation, a new message appeared at the top of the screen. It had arrived only minutes earlier. "Grant, hope the surgery worked. By the way, don't bring personal drama into next week's board meeting. We need everyone focused on business." I slowly handed the phone to Malcolm. He read the message once, then quietly set the phone back on the table. "Still doesn't understand what he's done," Malcolm said. I looked out the office window toward the city skyline, wondering whether Grant would ever understand. Malcolm carefully closed the folder before speaking again. "Will." Then he slid a sealed envelope across the table. It bore my father's familiar handwriting. Across the front, in dark blue ink, were 6 simple words: "To be opened before the final vote." The sealed envelope sat on Malcolm's conference table between us like it carried the weight of my father's entire life. My fingers instinctively reached toward it before stopping halfway. Dad's handwriting covered the front in the same careful script I'd watched him use when signing birthday cards, company documents, and Christmas gifts. "To be opened before the final vote." Just seeing those words made my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the surgery. "Can I read it now?" I asked quietly. Malcolm slowly shook his head. "Not yet." I looked at him, confused. "The board instructed me to keep Victor's wishes exactly as he wrote them. The envelope is opened during the succession meeting, not before." I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath. "Really planned for all of this, didn't he?" Malcolm smiled sadly. "Victor wasn't trying to predict the future. He simply understood people better than most of us." I stared at the envelope for another moment before nodding. "Then we'll do it his way." Malcolm carefully locked it inside his briefcase before changing the subject. "Your only responsibility this week is recovery." I almost laughed. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't. That's why I'm reminding you." The next several days passed more slowly than I expected. Recovery forced me to do something I'd almost forgotten how to do: sit still. Walking from my bedroom to the kitchen left me exhausted. Even making coffee required a break halfway through. My surgeon had warned me not to rush back into work, but after spending over a decade believing the company couldn't function without me, resting felt almost like failing. Every morning I found myself reaching for my laptop before remembering Malcolm's instructions. Heal first. Everything else could wait. Nora ignored my protests and visited nearly every afternoon with updates from the factory. She refused to let me log into company systems. Instead, she'd summarize what mattered while pretending the conversations were casual. "Production is ahead of schedule," she reported one afternoon while unpacking takeout containers onto my dining table. Shipping's on time. Clients are happy. And Grant? I asked. Nora rolled her eyes. He's acting like he's already been sworn in as king. I smiled despite myself. That bad. Worse. She handed me a container of soup before continuing. Who's reorganizing departments without board approval? He's scheduled meetings with outside consultants. Yesterday, he introduced himself to 2 new vendors as the incoming CEO. I lowered my spoon. Can he do that? Technically, Nora shrugged. Can introduce himself however he wants. Whether he'll actually become CEO is another question. I appreciated that she never asked Malcolm about confidential legal matters. She trusted the process. She trusted my father. More importantly, she trusted me. That loyalty became even more obvious 2 days later when I received another unexpected visitor. Daniel Pierce, our longest-serving production supervisor, knocked on my condo door carrying a small cardboard box. The night shift wanted you to have these, he explained awkwardly. Inside were dozens of handwritten cards from employees across every department. Some messages were only a sentence long. Others filled entire pages. One machine operator wrote about how I'd approved extra paid leave after his wife was diagnosed with cancer. Another employee thanked me for personally helping her finish college by creating a tuition reimbursement program years earlier. Someone had written simply, "You always saw us before you saw yourself. It's our turn now." I sat on my couch reading every card until long after Danielle had gone home. Not one of those people mentioned my position in the company. They weren't worried about who became CEO. They cared whether I survived. I finally understood something my father had spent years trying to teach me. Leadership isn't measured by authority. It's measured by whose lives become better because you showed up every day. Meanwhile, Grant seemed determined to prove the exact opposite. 3 days before the board meeting, Nora called while I was taking a short walk around my neighborhood. "You need to hear this?" she said without even saying hello. "Grant held a leadership meeting this morning." "Okay." "He announced a complete restructuring plan." I stopped walking. "The board hasn't approved anything?" "I know." Her voice grew quieter. "He also said the company needs leaders who can put business above personal emotions." I closed my eyes. I knew exactly who that comment had been aimed at. Did anyone respond? "Not publicly." She hesitated. "But after the meeting, 3 department heads came to my office. They wanted to know whether you'd really abandoned the company." I felt a dull ache spread through my chest, not physical pain. Something deeper. "What did you tell them?" "The truth," Nora answered immediately. "That you're recovering from heart surgery after spending years protecting this company." I smiled softly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Thank the reputation you spent 12 years earning." That conversation stayed with me the rest of the day. Reputations aren't built during promotions or celebrations. They're built quietly, one decision at a time, usually when nobody is watching. Grant had spent years building the image of a successful executive. I'd spent those same years building trust. Soon we'd find out which mattered more. The evening before the board meeting, Malcolm called again. "Everything's ready," he said. "The board has received the governance documents." "Including the clause?" "Including the clause." "How did Grant react?" Malcolm chuckled softly. "He doesn't know yet. Seriously. The complete governance packet wasn't distributed until this afternoon. Grant's been traveling all day meeting potential investors. I doubt he's opened it." I couldn't believe it. Typical Grant. He always assumed outcomes before reading instructions. "There's something else," Malcolm continued. "The board requested copies of your operational performance reviews covering the last 10 years. Why? Because someone wanted a complete picture before making the final decision." "Who requested them?" Malcolm smiled through the phone. "Actually, not me." Before I could ask another question, he added, "Get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be a long day." After we hung up, I stood by my living room window watching rain fall across the parking lot. For the first time since my diagnosis, I wasn't thinking about hospitals or medical bills. I was thinking about my father, about the countless evenings we'd spent walking through the factory after everyone else had gone home. He used to stop beside different workstations and ask me the same question. "Do you know what this company really builds?" I always answered, "Furniture." He'd smile and shake his head. "No, trust. Furniture just happens to pay the bills." At the time, I thought it was one of his many business philosophies. Now I finally understood. The company was never his greatest achievement. The people were. Early the next morning, I dressed more carefully than I had in weeks. My surgical incision still ached whenever I moved too quickly, but my doctor had cleared me to attend the meeting as long as I avoided unnecessary stress. I almost laughed at that advice. During the most important board meeting in our company's history, Malcolm arrived to pick me up shortly before 9. As I climbed into his car, I noticed his leather briefcase resting neatly on the back seat. "The envelope?" I asked. He nodded once. "Still sealed." Neither of us spoke during the drive downtown. We didn't need to. Some moments are too important for conversation. When we pulled into the company's headquarters, I immediately noticed something unusual. The main conference room lights were already on. Board members' cars filled the parking lot. Through the glass entrance, I could see Grant standing confidently in the lobby, shaking hands and smiling as though the outcome had already been decided. He hadn't seen me yet. Malcolm turned off the engine, looked directly at me, and quietly said, "Once we walk through those doors, nothing in this family will ever be the same again." The moment I stepped through the front doors, every conversation in the lobby seemed to fade into the background. Some people smiled when they saw me. Others looked genuinely surprised. A few executives had probably assumed I would still be recovering at home. Grant certainly hadn't expected me. His confident smile disappeared for just a fraction of a second before he quickly replaced it with the polished expression he used whenever cameras were nearby. "Marin," he said loudly enough for everyone around us to hear, "I'm glad you're feeling better." It sounded convincing. If I hadn't known him my entire life, I might have believed he actually meant it. I smiled politely. "Thank you." That was all I said. I wasn't there to argue in the lobby. Malcolm walked beside me, carrying his leather briefcase, and I noticed Grant's eyes briefly settle on it before returning to me. He had no idea what was inside. He probably assumed it contained ordinary legal documents related to the meeting. He couldn't have known it also carried my father's final instructions. Eleanor hurried across the lobby a few moments later. She embraced Grant first before turning toward me. Instead of hugging me, she lightly touched my arm. "You shouldn't have pushed yourself to come," she said. "You need rest." I looked at her for a moment before answering. "Dad taught me to show up when something matters." She looked away without responding. We entered the boardroom together. The long walnut conference table had been built by our own craftsmen years earlier under my father's supervision. I remembered standing beside him while he inspected every detail before the table was delivered upstairs. "Day," he'd said, running his hand across the polished surface. "Important decisions will be made here. Never let pride sit at this table." Those words echoed in my mind as I quietly took my seat. Around me sat 8 board members: Malcolm, our chief financial officer, Nora, and several senior executives invited to observe the succession process. Grant sat directly across from me wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. He looked completely relaxed. Why wouldn't he? As far as he knew, today was simply a formality. The chairman of the board called the meeting to order shortly after 10 o'clock. Routine financial reports came first: revenue projections, manufacturing forecasts, expansion opportunities. Grant answered several questions confidently, presenting impressive sales numbers from the previous fiscal year. I listened quietly. None of what he said was false. Sales had indeed improved, but he carefully avoided mentioning that many of those contracts existed only because operations had consistently delivered on impossible deadlines over the past several years. Success rarely belongs to just one department, but Grant had always been skilled at making teamwork sound like personal achievement. After nearly 40 minutes, the chairman closed the financial binder and looked toward Malcolm. "Before we proceed with the succession vote," he said, "our legal counsel has requested time to review the governance requirements established by our founder." Grant leaned back comfortably. "Of course," he said. "Let's keep everything by the book." Malcolm stood slowly, carrying the familiar blue governance binder to the front of the room. His calm voice filled the conference room without needing to rise above a normal conversation. Several years before Victor Holloway's passing, the company's governance documents were amended to include leadership qualifications beyond financial performance. I noticed Grant's smile weaken slightly. Malcolm continued reading. These amendments require that any candidate for chief executive officer demonstrate integrity, stewardship, responsibility toward employees, and responsibility toward immediate family during times of extraordinary hardship. A few board members quietly turned pages inside their own document packets. Grant frowned. "I've reviewed the governance manual before," he interrupted. "I don't remember that section." Malcolm looked directly at him. "The section has existed for more than 5 years." A silence settled over the room. Malcolm continued. "Specifically, the board retains authority to deny or revoke any executive succession when credible evidence demonstrates that a candidate knowingly abandoned an immediate family member facing a significant personal crisis for reasons of personal convenience, financial self-interest, or personal advancement." This time even Grant stopped pretending to be relaxed. He leaned forward in his chair. "What exactly are you implying?" Malcolm didn't answer immediately. Instead, he returned to the table, opened his briefcase, and carefully removed several folders. "Last month," he said, Marin Holloway was diagnosed with a serious cardiac condition requiring immediate surgery. I noticed several board members glance toward me with expressions of genuine concern." Malcolm continued. "The required procedure included an insurance shortfall of $4,200. Grant shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. Malcolm placed a printed transcript of text messages onto the presentation screen. "Following the diagnosis, Ms. Holloway requested temporary financial assistance from her brother, Mr. Grant Holloway. The room became so quiet I could hear the air conditioning." Malcolm looked toward Grant before speaking again. "Ms. Holloway, do you deny refusing that request?" Grant crossed his arms. "I never had a legal obligation to give anyone money." "That wasn't my question." Another pause. "No," Grant finally admitted. "I refused." Malcolm nodded once. "Do you deny describing your sister as a lost cause during that conversation?" Grant's jaw tightened. "It was a private conversation." "Do you deny saying it?" Grant looked around the room as though searching for support. None came. Finally, he answered, "No." Malcolm pressed a button on the presentation remote. A copy of Grant's text message from several days after my surgery appeared on the large screen behind him. "Hope the surgery worked. Don't bring personal drama into next week's board meeting. We need everyone focused on business." Nobody spoke. Malcolm allowed the silence to settle before continuing. "The board requested a complete review of leadership qualifications. These communications have been included as evidence relevant to the Family Stewardship Clause." Grant suddenly stood up. "This is ridiculous." His voice echoed through the room. "We're talking about a private family disagreement." The chairman calmly folded his hands. "We're discussing executive judgment." Grant looked directly at me for the first time since the meeting began. "You actually brought this here." Every eye in the room shifted toward me. I remained seated. "No, Grant." My voice stayed calm. "You brought it here the day you decided my life mattered less than $4,000. He opened his mouth but no words came out. Malcolm then reached into his briefcase one final time and slowly placed the sealed envelope bearing my father's handwriting on the conference table. "Before this board reaches its decision," he said quietly, Victor Holloway left one final statement to be read aloud. Every person in the room watched as Malcolm carefully broke the seal. Malcolm unfolded the letter with the same care my father used whenever he handled original blueprints or handwritten contracts. The room had become so quiet that the rustling paper sounded impossibly loud. Grant remained standing, his hands pressed against the conference table, while my mother stared at the envelope as if willing it to disappear. I couldn't take my eyes off my father's handwriting. It had been 6 years since I'd heard his voice, yet somehow those few sheets of paper made him feel closer than he had in years. Malcolm adjusted his glasses before reading aloud. "To the members of the board, if this letter is being opened, it means the time has come to choose who will protect not only this company, but also the people whose lives depend on it. I founded Holloway Custom Furnishings to provide for my family, but I kept it alive because of the families who worked beside us every day. Never forget that leadership is a responsibility before it is a privilege." He paused briefly before continuing. "During my lifetime, many people assumed my greatest concern was revenue. They were mistaken. Revenue can always be rebuilt. Character cannot. The person worthy of leading this company will never be the one who speaks the loudest, demands the most attention, or believes success belongs only to them. The right leader will always choose people before pride. I felt tears forming before Malcolm had even reached the middle of the page. Those weren't legal instructions. They were the lessons my father had repeated throughout my childhood, written down one last time in case none of us remembered them when he was gone. Malcolm continued, "If a day ever comes when one of my children values personal ambition above compassion, then I ask this board to protect the company from that decision. A person who cannot stand beside family during genuine hardship will eventually abandon employees when profits become inconvenient. I built this company to outlive me. Please ensure it is never entrusted to someone who mistakes authority for leadership." Nobody moved. Even Grant had stopped trying to interrupt. Malcolm folded the final page and looked toward the chairman. "That concludes Victor Holloway's statement." The chairman remained silent for several seconds before speaking. "Thank you." He then turned toward Grant. "Mr. Holloway, before the board begins deliberation, do you wish to respond?" Grant finally sat down, though the confidence he'd walked into the room with had completely disappeared. "This is unfair," he said quietly. "I made one decision during a stressful situation." One of the independent board members, a retired executive named Helen Mercer, who had known my father for almost 20 years, leaned forward. "One decision?" she asked. "Or one decision that revealed how you make all the others?" Grant looked frustrated. "I never expected things to go this far." Helen nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly what concerns me." Another board member spoke next. "Mr. Holloway, did you know your sister refinanced her home 4 years ago to ensure employees kept receiving paychecks during the supply chain crisis?" Grant blinked. "No. Did you know she rejected an executive position with another company after your father's death because she believed Holloway Custom Furnishings needed stability?" "No. Did you know she personally covered health insurance premiums for several employees when cash flow became critical?" Grant looked toward me, genuinely confused. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" I answered before anyone else could. "Because I wasn't doing those things for recognition." Silence returned. The chairman slowly removed his reading glasses. "This board has reviewed operational performance over the past decade." He looked directly at Grant. "Sales matter, but operations, employee retention, customer satisfaction, and long-term stability matter just as much. Your sister consistently exceeded expectations in every category." Grant's shoulders slowly slumped. "So this meeting was never really about becoming CEO?" "No," Helen answered softly. "It was always about proving who deserved the responsibility." My mother suddenly stood up. "This is getting out of hand," she said, her voice shaking. Grant made a mistake. Families forgive mistakes. Malcolm remained calm. Families often do. He gently closed the letter before continuing. "Corporate governance doesn't ignore them." Eleanor looked desperately around the room. "Surely one phone call shouldn't decide my son's future." Helen looked directly at her. "The phone call didn't decide anything." She gestured toward the stack of reports beside her. "Years of leadership did. The phone call simply confirmed concerns this board had already begun discussing." I watched my mother's face change as she slowly realized this wasn't some elaborate plan created against Grant. Nobody had set a trap. The trap had been built by years of choices neither of them believed would ever have consequences. The chairman looked around the table one final time. "Unless there are additional comments, the board will now enter executive session." One by one, the observers quietly left the room. Nora squeezed my shoulder as she passed behind my chair. Malcolm gathered his papers without saying a word. Grant remained seated, staring down at the polished walnut table my father had once admired. Before the board members disappeared into the adjoining conference room, the chairman stopped beside me. "Ms. Holloway?" he said quietly. "Thank you for attending despite your recovery." I nodded politely. "Thank you for listening." The door closed behind them, leaving only my mother, Grant, Malcolm, and me inside the main conference room. For almost 20 minutes nobody spoke. Grant finally broke the silence. "Did you want this?" he asked without looking at me. I thought carefully before answering. "No." He finally raised his eyes. "Then why didn't you stop it?" I held his gaze. "Because I spent too many years protecting you from the consequences of your choices." His face tightened. "You're really going to let them take everything from me?" I slowly shook my head. "Grant, I'm not taking anything from you. You gave it away the moment you decided my life wasn't worth helping." Before he could answer, the conference room door opened. Every board member returned to their seats. The chairman carried a single sheet of paper in his hand. He looked older than he had an hour earlier. The board has reached its decision. No one breathed. He unfolded the paper and read slowly. By unanimous vote, the board has determined that Mr. Grant Holloway does not meet the leadership standards established under the company's governance policy, including the Family Stewardship Clause. Grant closed his eyes. The chairman continued. Effective immediately, the current succession process is suspended. An external executive search will begin for the position of Chief Executive Officer. My mother gasped. Grant didn't move. Furthermore, the chairman added, Marin Holloway is invited to remain Chief Operations Officer and assume a permanent seat on the board of directors should she choose to accept. Every head in the room turned toward me. I looked down at my still, healing hands before lifting my eyes again. Then I quietly said the one sentence no one had expected to hear. I accept the board seat. I paused long enough for everyone to wonder what came next, but I respectfully declined the CO position. The entire room fell silent once again. For a moment, I thought I'd said the words too quietly for anyone to hear. Then I looked around the room and realized every single person was staring at me. Grant looked confused. My mother looked completely stunned. Even Malcolm raised his eyebrows slightly, though he recovered almost immediately. The chairman adjusted his glasses. Holloway. Did I hear you correctly? I nodded. Yes. He looked down at the resolution in front of him before asking again. You're declining the position of Chief Executive Officer. I am. A silence settled over the conference room unlike any we'd experienced that morning. It wasn't tense anymore. It was puzzled. Grant finally let out a short laugh that sounded more exhausted than amused. You've wanted that job your whole life. I slowly shook my head. No, Grant. I looked directly at him. I've wanted Dad's company to survive. Those aren't the same thing. He frowned as if he genuinely couldn't understand the difference. For years he had believed the CO title represented victory. To me, it had always represented responsibility. After everything that had happened over the past few weeks, I finally understood something about myself. I no longer needed a title to prove my worth. The chairman leaned forward. Would you care to explain your decision? I took a slow breath before answering. 3 weeks ago, I thought losing this position would destroy me. Then I almost lost my life instead. I glanced around the table, making eye contact with each board member. During my recovery, I realized I'd spent years believing my value depended on how much I sacrificed. I don't believe that anymore. Nobody interrupted. This company deserves a leader who's completely focused on its future. Right now, I need to focus on rebuilding my health. I smiled gently. That doesn't mean I'm walking away. I'll gladly serve on the board. I'll continue supporting operations however I can. But for the first time in a very long time, I'm choosing my life before my work. Helen Mercer smiled warmly. Victor would have liked that answer. I felt tears threatening again. I hope so. The chairman nodded. Very well. The board accepts your decision. We will begin an external executive search immediately. Until then, operational authority will remain unchanged. The meeting officially ended a few minutes later. Chairs slid backward across the floor. Papers were collected. Board members quietly approached me one by one. Some offered congratulations. Others simply shook my hand and wished me a full recovery. Not one of them mentioned revenge. They talked about integrity, leadership, and my father's legacy. That meant more to me than they probably realized. Eventually, the conference room emptied until only 4 people remained. Malcolm was organizing his files near the far end of the table. My mother stood silently beside one of the windows. Grant hadn't moved from his chair. He stared down at the polished tabletop as though hoping the last 2 hours had never happened. I gathered my folder and turned toward the door. Marin. Grant's voice stopped me. I looked back. For the first time since we were children, I saw something in his eyes I'd never associated with my younger brother. Fear. Real fear. He stood slowly. Can we talk? Malcolm quietly picked up his briefcase and walked out of the room without saying a word. My mother remained where she was, watching both of us. Grant rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. I didn't think. He stopped speaking before trying again. I honestly didn't think refusing the money would become something like this. I folded my arms gently across my chest, careful not to put pressure on my healing incision. I know. He looked surprised. You do? Yes, I nodded. That's exactly the problem. He frowned. What does that mean? I took a few slow steps closer. You never thought about what it would feel like for me. You never imagined sitting in a hospital parking lot wondering whether your own family believed your life was worth $4,000. Grant lowered his eyes. I was under pressure. So was I. I thought you'd figure something out. I smiled sadly. You always thought someone else would carry the hard part. The words landed harder than I intended. Maybe because they were true. Grant had spent his entire life assuming someone else would solve problems before they reached him. Dad, me, the employees. Anyone willing to carry the weight he didn't want to feel. He looked up again, and for the first time his confidence was completely gone. I'm sorry. Those two words hung between us. Weeks earlier, I would have given almost anything to hear them. Now they felt strangely small, not meaningless. Just late. I believe you are, I answered honestly. Then can't we fix this? I looked at my brother for a long moment. Grant, this was never about the board meeting? Then what was it about? Trust. My voice remained calm. When I called you, I wasn't asking for a promotion. I wasn't asking for half your savings. I was asking whether my life mattered to you. He closed his eyes. It did. Then why didn't your actions show it? He didn't have an answer. Across the room, my mother finally walked toward us. Her eyes were red. I wasn't sure whether she'd been crying or simply looked exhausted. Marin, she whispered. I turned toward her. For several seconds she couldn't find the words. Finally she reached out as if she wanted to hold my hand, then stopped herself halfway. I failed you. Hearing those words from my mother hurt almost as much as hearing Grant call me a lost cause. Because deep down, I'd wanted to hear them for years, not as an apology, as an acknowledgement that what I'd experienced had been real. I should have listened. She continued quietly. I kept telling myself Grant needed more encouragement because you always seemed so strong. I smiled faintly. Strong people still need someone in their corner. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I know that now. I wanted to be angry. Part of me expected anger to return. Instead, all I felt was sadness. We had lost so many years pretending everything was fair when it never had been. Mom, I said softly, I don't hate you. She looked up hopefully. But I can't pretend those years didn't happen either. She nodded through her tears. I understand. I believed she meant it. Whether that understanding had come too late was another question entirely. I walked toward the conference room door before stopping one final time. Grant was still standing beside the table, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. One more thing, I said. He looked at me. You asked earlier why I declined becoming CEO. He nodded silently. Because if I'd accepted it today, everyone would have believed this was about winning. I placed my hand on the doorknob. It never was. I opened the door and looked back one last time. This was about finally realizing I didn't need this family to tell me I was worth saving. I walked into the hallway without waiting for another response. Behind me, nobody called my name. Walking out of that conference room should have felt like the biggest victory of my life. Instead, it felt surprisingly quiet. For years, I'd imagined that if justice ever came, it would arrive with applause, dramatic speeches, or the satisfaction of watching the people who hurt me finally understand my pain. Real life didn't work that way. Justice rarely sounds loud. Sometimes it sounds like a closing door, a deep breath, and the realization that you no longer need to fight for a place where you were never truly valued. I stepped into the elevator alone and watched the doors close. My reflection stared back at me from the polished metal walls. The woman looking back wasn't the same person who had sat crying in a hospital parking garage only a few weeks earlier. The scar beneath my blouse would always remind me of the surgery that saved my life, but the invisible wound, the one that had spent years begging for my family's approval, had finally begun to heal. When the elevator reached the lobby, several employees were waiting nearby. None of them knew exactly what had happened upstairs, but judging by the expressions on their faces, rumors had already begun spreading through the building. Daniel Pierce was the first to approach me. Everything okay? He asked carefully. I smiled. Everything is finally honest. He looked confused for a second before smiling back. That's probably better? I nodded. It is. By the time I reached the factory floor, more employees had quietly gathered near the assembly area. Nobody had organized it. They simply saw me walking through the building and stopped what they were doing. Men and women I'd worked beside for over a decade stood silently, waiting. I realized they weren't looking for gossip. They were looking for reassurance. I climbed onto a small loading platform so everyone could see me without crowding together. My chest still ached whenever I raised my voice, so I spoke slowly. First, I said, thank you. Several people exchanged puzzled looks. I wouldn't be standing here today without you. I held up the small envelope that still contained copies of the anonymous notes I'd received before surgery, when my own future looked uncertain. You reminded me what this company was really built on. The warehouse became completely silent. Some of you gave money you couldn't easily spare. Some of you sent cards. Some of you simply prayed for me. Every single one of those things mattered. I paused to steady my breathing. Today, the board made an important decision about the company's future. But I want you to hear something directly from me before you hear it from anyone else. Dozens of eyes remained fixed on me. I will continue serving this company as a member of the board and as your chief operations officer while I recover. The board will begin searching for an outside CEO with experience leading manufacturing companies like ours. A few surprised murmurs spread through the crowd. Before anyone could ask questions, I continued. Some of you may wonder why I didn't accept the position myself. I smiled gently. Because this company deserves someone who can give 100% right now. My responsibility is getting healthy enough to continue serving all of you for many years, not proving something to anyone. Daniel nodded slowly. Then someone near the back of the warehouse began clapping. Another employee joined in. Within seconds, the entire building echoed with applause. It wasn't for a promotion. It wasn't because I defeated my brother. It was because they knew I had chosen honesty over pride. I looked around at the people surrounding me and realized something that almost made me cry. This was the family I'd been searching for all along. They weren't connected to me by blood. They were connected by years of trust, respect, and showing up for one another when life became difficult. A week later, the board officially announced the appointment of an experienced manufacturing executive named Richard Alvarez as interim CEO while a permanent search was conducted. Richard met with every department individually during his first month. One of the first things he told me surprised me. I've reviewed the company's performance over the last 10 years, he said. Your fingerprints are everywhere. I laughed softly. Most people never noticed. He smiled. Good leaders usually don't leave fingerprints for recognition. They leave systems that continue working after they're gone. Working beside Richard turned out to be easier than I expected. He never treated me like competition. Instead, he regularly asked for my advice because he understood something Grant never had. You don't replace institutional knowledge overnight. You respect it. About 2 months after the board meeting, I received an invitation to lunch from my mother. For several days, I considered declining. Eventually, I accepted, not because everything had been forgiven, but because healing sometimes requires conversations you've avoided for too long. We met at a small cafe near the park where my father used to take us on Sunday afternoons. Mom looked older than I remembered, not physically, emotionally. Regret has a way of aging people faster than time. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup before speaking. The house feels different now. I understood what she meant. Grant had moved into a downtown apartment shortly after the board's decision. He no longer came by every evening. The constant confidence that had once filled the house had disappeared with him. How's Grant? I asked. She looked down. He's seeing a leadership coach. That surprised me. Really? She nodded. He told me something a few weeks ago. What? She smiled sadly. Said losing the CEO position hurt less than realizing everyone respected you more than him. I remained quiet. He finally understands that respect isn't something parents can give their children. She continued. It has to be earned. I took a sip of my tea before answering. I hope he really learns that. She reached across the table, hesitating before gently placing her hand over mine. This time I didn't pull away. I can't change the past, she whispered. I know. But I'd like a chance to do better. I looked into my mother's eyes and saw genuine remorse instead of excuses. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's deciding the past no longer gets to control your future. We'll take it one step at a time, I said. Tears quietly rolled down her cheeks as she nodded. Several months later, after completing my cardiac rehabilitation, I returned to work full-time. The company was stronger than it had been in years. Employee turnover had dropped to its lowest level in over a decade. Client satisfaction continued improving. Richard eventually accepted the permanent CO position, and I was genuinely happy about it. Together, we launched a new employee health assistance fund using a portion of the company's annual profits. The first proposal I presented to the board was simple. No employee or immediate family member should ever have to delay life, saving medical treatment because they couldn't afford the deductible. The motion passed unanimously. Every time I signed paperwork approving emergency medical assistance for an employee, I remembered sitting in that hospital parking garage believing I was alone. Nobody else at Holloway Custom Furnishings would ever have to feel that way if I could prevent it. A year after my surgery, I visited my father's grave on a quiet autumn afternoon. I placed fresh white lilies beside the headstone and sat there for a long time without speaking. Finally, I smiled. "You were right, Dad." A cool breeze moved through the trees. The company was never really about furniture. I looked toward the horizon where the late afternoon sun painted everything gold. It was always about people. As I stood to leave, I realized something I wished I'd understood years earlier. The greatest revenge isn't watching someone lose everything. It's refusing to lose yourself because of what they did to you. Grant once called me lost cause. In the end, I wasn't the one who had been lost. A little over 2 years have passed since the day my brother decided I was a lost cause, and sometimes I still think about that phone call. Not because it hurts anymore, but because it reminds me how quickly a single choice can reveal who we truly are. The scar across my chest has faded into a thin white line that most people never notice. Yet, every morning it reminds me that I was given another chance to live a life I almost lost while trying to earn love that should have been freely given. These days, my mornings look very different. I still arrive at Holloway Custom Furnishings early, but not before taking a walk through the park near my home. I no longer answer emails before sunrise or cancel doctor's appointments because work feels more important. I learned the hard way that a company can replace a position much faster than the people who love you can replace your life. The Employee Health Assistance Fund has already helped dozens of families cover emergency surgeries, cancer treatments, and unexpected medical expenses. Every time I approve another request, I quietly remember the fear of sitting in that hospital parking garage wondering whether $4,200 would decide my future. No one working for our company has faced that fear alone since. Richard has become exactly the kind of CEO my father hoped the company would one day have. He leads with humility, asks questions before making decisions, and never forgets that every number on a financial report represents real people with real families. Watching the company grow without sacrificing its values has been one of the greatest gifts of my life. As for Grant, we aren't close, but we aren't strangers anymore either. Once every few months we meet for coffee. We don't pretend the past never happened, and we don't force conversations that neither of us is ready to have. We simply keep showing up, one honest conversation at a time. That's enough for now. My mother still apologizes more often than she probably needs to, but I've stopped asking her to make up for years that neither of us can change. Instead, we've started building new memories, slower and quieter than before. Healing, I've learned, isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about refusing to let yesterday decide who you become tomorrow. Sometimes people ask me whether I regret refusing the CEO position. The answer has never changed. No, because the greatest promotion I ever received wasn't a title. It was finally believing that my value never depended on someone else's approval. If my story proves anything, I hope it's this. The people who call you a lost cause are often revealing far more about themselves than they ever reveal about you. And now I'd love to know, if someone who had deeply betrayed your trust came back years later with genuine regret, would you give them a second chance, or would some wounds always remain too deep to heal?